Section 5, Regulatory Tools. This is Part A of Section 5. So we just talked about a set of non-regulatory strategies. These are ones that don't involve adopting bylaws or ordinance. Another strategy for guiding what happens on the land is regulation. The goal of this next section is to provide you with a general understanding of regulatory actions you can take for natural resource protection and enhancement. An image note here. This is a sketch developed from a publication called New Models for Commercial and Industrial Development by the Vermont Forum on Sprawl and the Vermont Business Roundtable 2003. It shows a concept of what zoning could look like in a Vermont downtown. The link to this image is in the resource section. Regulatory approaches we'll cover in this section include subdivision, zoning, site design, and we'll also talk briefly about ordinances and standalone bylaws, smart growth, and other things to consider. So why use regulations? I think this image on the slide here is a really good example of why. Because change is incremental, and bad changes can add up over time, but so can good ones. Regulations are a tool intended to guide development so that the sum of the parts adds up to the town that you desire. It can apply to different size towns as well. In slow growth areas, it's easy to say, well, nothing happens here, so why do we need to put in the effort? Another way to look at it is that when a development is before your town, you're ready to make the most of it. In fast growth areas, regulations can help make sure roads aren't overwhelmed, that new development complements existing development, that stormwater is managed appropriately, and that the change supports the character of your town. So when we're talking about resources like watersheds, forest blocks, and wildlife corridors, these things seem like they won't be damaged easily, but are affected by cumulative changes. This means that thinking about the nature of each change, at the site level, and then also at the larger landscape level, and this really matters. Regulations can be crafted so that it takes into account both levels and strikes a balance with other community goals, which is really important. As we mentioned before, Act 250 reviews a very limited amount of development, which means local review is important and essential for shaping projects. Both regulation and change are topics that naturally raise a lot of questions, so high-quality outreach and engagement on the front end are particularly important if you're considering adopting regulation. It makes sense that people would have questions or concerns. You're talking about changes that could affect people's property, so you need to be able to explain the reason for using the regulation instead of something else. You're talking about a tool that's kind of technical. You need to be able to articulate how it will play out on the land. You want to be able to talk to the community about what it will gain from zoning and how it will help. And you need to have ways to get input and ideas back from the community. We'll talk more about this in Module C, but I do want to point out that outreach is just more than meetings. And no matter what type of projects you're undertaking, connecting people with the places they live helps generate support and ideas. So now we're on to the tools themselves. Subdivision regulations guide the overall pattern of development, including how the land is dividing up and where the development is located on the parcel. Traditionally, subdivision regulations have been used to help regulate the efficient development of things like roads, water, and sewer. However, because they focus on how the land is divided and how parcels are configured, subdivision regulations are an important tool for reducing forest and habitat fragmentation and reducing impacts on other natural resources. In a rural state, subdivision regulations are at least as important as zoning because the configuration of the parcels affects how development is spread across the land and how services are provided. This has natural resource impacts as well as fiscal impacts for a town. In Vermont, about 50% of the towns have subdivision regulations. Zoning and subdivision regulations are used together to create the pattern and character you want to achieve in your town. One point I want to make is that subdivision regulations affect the design of a parcel, as you see here, where buildings and roads go on the parcel. There are configurations that can support preservation of natural resources. The configuration on the right, for example, would be a good way to avoid building in a wildlife corridor because it conserves a lot of open land. But subdivision regulations and zoning together will create an overall settlement pattern of a town. In this aerial view in the town of Norwich, you can see on the left is a subdivision that looks a lot like a village area. The buildings are close together, the lots are small. To the right is a development much more spread out and fragments the forest and appears disconnected from the village. And so this is why subdivision regulations are really important. An image note here. So Norwich's 2009 zoning indicates that the area in the circle on the left is the VR1 zoning district, where lot sizes are a minimum of 20,000 square feet. The area on the right is the RR district, also known as a rural residential, with a minimum lot size of 2 acres. The area on the right was built before the 2002 adoption of the town's subdivision regulations, which do have standards now to avoid impacts to natural resources. Regulations that guide how land is divided are important for another reason too. You may remember this image from NR1. This shows subdivisions with open space set aside. The open space is the area in green. And even though there is open space, it isn't connected, so it's not useful for purposes like agricultural, wildlife passage, or even for forest or water quality purposes. In other words, it is less likely to be ecologically function when it is in a configuration like this, even if it does have the benefit of giving people a sense of privacy or open land. So subdivision regulations are a tool that can help ensure that the open space that is created when the land is subdivided fits into the bigger functional picture. Like zoning, subdivision bylaws may include design guidelines or standards to promote conservation of various natural resources. In the gray box here is an example of a standard. Roads, driveways, and utilities shall be designed to avoid the fragmentation of identified natural areas and wildlife habitat. This standard is a way to avoid out like we frequently see along our roads, where houses and driveways cut across the open field and fragment the land. This is the picture on the left. The layout out on the right consolidates driveways and places houses so that they don't cut into the woods as much and they can keep the space open. Another standard illustrated on the right is that of a shared driveway. To really make this work, though, you need to make sure people have privacy, so you'll need to take into account the design and the location of the lots. Another thing to notice about this standard in the gray box is that it uses the word shall. Standards need to have mandatory language to pass legal muster. Standards can address other resources too, like water quality and stormwater runoff, reducing impervious areas, maintaining a canopy cover as an alternative to building stormwater infrastructure as well. Note, in these images, these are the same lot sizes and density, but they're configured in a different alternative. If you're thinking about subdivision regulations as a tool to protect natural resources, here are some things to consider. So that's a little bit about subdivision regulations, which affect the overall pattern of development on the landscape. Next, I want to talk about zoning, which affects individual parcels and their uses. Zoning typically divides the town into districts. So when development happens, it's subject to the different standards depending on which district it's located in. The standards usually include things like uses and how far a building is set back from the property line. There may also be standards for natural resources. A lot of Vermont zoning and zoning everywhere is built on the principle of dividing land into zones based on what can happen there and separating the uses. We know now it's not necessary to separate uses, and there's benefits of having mixed use. The way zoning is written, it's focused on how regulation affects each parcel, but for what we're talking about, it's really important to remember the overall arrangement of zoning districts creates a settlement pattern, and that pattern can affect natural resources. So in Vermont, the first town to adopt zoning was St. Johnsbury, and we think this was around 1931 because of the fires. So where does zoning come from, and why is it allowed in the first place? Why are towns allowed to regulate private property? The purpose of zoning is to help towns to protect health, safety, and welfare. Its origins are actually from the early 1900s for public health and safety. It has a long history in Vermont and elsewhere, and has been determined by the U.S. Supreme Court to be constitutional. But if the origins are in public health and safety, why is zoning allowed to be used for natural resource protection? In Vermont, the part of the statute that says how towns may use zoning says zoning can be used to implement the policies in the town plan and to implement Vermont's planning goals. Both of these include goals related to natural resource protection. In this way, zoning is a tool that helps implement local plans in Vermont. So, will zoning create world peace? Maybe not, but it's definitely a tool in our toolbox. I'd like to talk about zoning districts geared towards natural resource protection. Chapter 117, the section of the Vermont statute that covers land use planning, allows towns to create zoning districts that help safeguard certain areas from intensive development. These types of zoning districts can help avoid fragmentation, keep forest lands working, and protect habitat. The boundaries of these districts are typically defined by on-the-ground features, like a forest cover, a special natural area, or an existing conserved land. There are a few ways that the zoning districts can help protect natural resources. For example, the purpose statement within the zoning bylaws. This can describe what a district is supposed to accomplish and should emphasize natural resource protection. A district can have lower density through larger lot sizes. It may limit certain uses like year-round residential units, and it may have separate review standards. I mentioned large lot sizes on the last slide. I should say that large lot sizes do create a low density, like this picture shows. Lots of open space and few housing units. This slide shows a pretty good land use from a natural resource perspective as well. There is an open field, a little bit of stream buffer, and land that is being used for agricultural purposes. The house is close to the road, and there aren't other houses or roads dividing it. This could be the result of a large agricultural residential district, which is a pretty common district in Vermont. However, just because a district has large lots, it doesn't mean that it's conserving land. Here you see broad road frontages from setback requirements. You see large lot sizes that can lead to leapfrogging development. And because of the driveways, the impermeable surfaces like roofs and roads, and the human activity, zoning like this can lead to forest and habitat fragmentation or affect floodplain function. And even if this was a forested area, the buildings and roads would still have an impact because the impacts of the development are felt beyond the cleared areas. Approaches like planned unit developments and clustering can help avoid impacts shown in this image. Another approach to avoiding fragmentation through large minimum lot sizes, like we just saw on the previous slide, is the idea of density-based zoning. Usually density is regulated by lot size. For example, if you have a 25-acre minimum lot size, your overall density is going to be 1 dwelling unit per 25 acres. But there's also the risk that this could be pretty land consumptive, like the slide we just looked at. There might be lower densities, but development also consumes a fair amount of land. Density-based zoning regulates density separately from lot size. The picture above illustrates this idea. Say this represents 100 acres. You could split it into 4 sections and put a house in the middle of each new lot. Or you could divide it as the illustration does. You get less fragmentation, and with the right design you can end up with plenty of privacy and continued agricultural uses. Like conservation zoning, this helps intact blocks of farm and forest land and can support maintaining high water quality. Another tool is an overlay district. This is a zoning district where boundaries are drawn around a resource that requires special consideration, like a flood hazard area or a wildlife corridor. The underlying zoning still applies, but there might be additional standards that must be met within the overlay district. It can be a good way to customize the standards to a very specific resource. In the example here, the first illustration shows a parcel before development. The forested area is a wildlife corridor, and there are houses on the right. In this next image, the dashed line shows an overlay district around the wildlife corridor. Within this district, there are standards that can guide the siting of new houses. For example, one standard could be that if a parcel has buildable land outside the corridor, you are required to put the house there. If the parcel doesn't include land outside the corridor, like up here, the standard might be to put development as close to the edge as possible. These standards would help prevent situations like this up here, where a lot of land is cleared and the house is right in the middle of corridor, blocking wildlife migration. Here are a few things to consider about using zoning for natural resource protection and enhancement. When you limit or shape development in sensitive areas, it helps protect vulnerable resources. Because zoning divides a town into districts, it works well for resources that are contiguous, like forests, which are relatively easy to delineate on a map and then manage. Zoning affects how things get built, so it provides some long-term protections, but it isn't permanent and it can be changed. On the other hand, it takes resources to administer. Conditional uses need to be reviewed by a development review board or zoning board of adjustment. This takes some work. You may also need to defend some decisions in court. And as I mentioned before, it can be controversial. Even when people recognize a regulation may have a role to play, they may resist it because it's unclear of what the impact will be and what it will be on them. And if zoning isn't done correctly, it can undermine natural resources, as we saw in the picture earlier showing the large lot development. Lastly, zoning by definition guides new development and sometimes renovations. In a slow growth environment, it helps review what is happening, but it may not impact many projects. Here's an example of a conservation district from Bolton, Vermont. Bolton is in Chittenden County and has a population of about 1,200 people. It's rural and heavily forested and also the home of Bolton Valley Ski Resort. So what did they do? In 2005, Bolton adopted a conservation zoning district. How did they do it? Bolton wanted to protect its remote forest areas from fragmentation and development, but they were also motivated by wanting to accommodate a ski area expansion while minimizing environmental impacts. The conservation district includes all lands above 2,500 feet plus already conserved lands. In this district, there are specific standards to protect natural resources. For example, there's the option to limit the amount of land that can be cleared for development, and the town can limit clearing around the developed area. So how did the project help? It generally works well to protect key resources, and it provided enough guidance for it to be usable during the development review process. And this is something that's key for making any regulation work. But there are a few takeaways from the project that might help if you're considering doing something similar in your town. The ski area expansion included the use of existing and new trails by an off-road driving school. This use wasn't adequately anticipated under the regulations when the standards were drafted regarding commercial outdoor recreational uses, including trail siting, development, and maintenance standards. So it has been hard to manage that use, even though it's partly in this district and has real natural resource impacts. So the town is continuing to evaluate how effective the district is as a next step. And it's going to use a recently completed natural resource inventory to better identify, define, and address wildlife habitat the next time they update the regulations. So we've talked about subdivision regulations at the larger landscape level. We've talked about zoning districts and how it relates to districts and parcel uses. And now we're going to talk about site design standards at the site-specific level. So this is another regulatory approach, and it regulates how development happens on a parcel. These standards could be included in your zoning or subdivision regulations. So what do I mean by site design? This includes where buildings and roads go, how much land is cleared, how much impervious surface is allowed, and it applies if you're building on a parcel or moving a road or putting in an additional structure. For example, in the gray box here is a standard designed to manage stormwater. So the example is stormwater shall be managed through land development strategies that emphasize the reduction of impervious surface areas such as streets, sidewalks, driveway, and parking areas and roofs. Ways this may be achieved. You can reduce driveway lengths by minimizing setback distances, encourage required shared driveways. So things to consider when designing site design standards. Good site design connects a parcel to the larger landscape, and this can help you meet your community goals. So considering the location of building lots and infrastructure is important, but you need to also think about the open space that's left and how it connects to the surrounding open space. And smart growth is in appropriate places. Site design does not always change the fact that some development, even though it is good site design by being compact, is built in detached locations that have greater impacts because of transportation, parking, or sprawl. Even towns without zoning can adopt ordinances or standalone bylaws that address some natural resource issues. Using flood hazard bylaws, towns can limit property damage, improve safety, and protect river corridors by giving rivers space to move. They can either prohibit development in flood hazard areas or review it to make sure it meets certain standards for flood resistance. It's required if towns want property owners to be eligible for flood insurance. The downside of having this is that it has the effect of subsidizing development in floodplains, which is essentially bad for the floodplain and the property. Towns can also have standalone road ordinances, which require certain construction standards to minimize stormwater runoff, or they might have standards to keep long roads from fragmenting forests or to maintain vegetation in the rights-of-way. Lastly, Vermont statute allows town to adopt an ordinance or bylaw that establishes screening requirements for ground-mounted solar energy. The screening requirements cannot have the effect of prohibiting solar development, and they cannot be more stringent than any screening the town requires for commercial development. However, if the standards are properly drafted, they must be incorporated into a project's certificate of public good by the Public Service Board. This approach really only deals with aesthetics, and if the setbacks push development into forests or farmland, the screening requirements can actually cause fragmentation. So it's really important and necessary to find the balance between the two. Lastly, I want to mention an overarching principle that can be used to support natural resource protection. This is smart growth. Smart growth means focusing new development in compact centers. Locating houses, services, and jobs in these locations helps protect natural resources in a few ways. It uses less land. It keeps farms and forests intact. And it puts things closer together so people who want to have the option to walk or take transit use less energy to get around. Vermont's villages and downtowns are examples of smart growth, and the designation programs through the Department of Housing and Community Development help support this approach. I mention it here because smart growth is something you can promote through your zoning, subdivision, and site design. And again, we're back at that idea of how the patterns of how we use land support healthy natural resources. One thing to consider is that a lot of Vermont's existing villages are located in the floodplains. As you plan and zone to reinforce development in these areas, you need to be careful about impervious surface and stormwater runoff. You'll also need to make sure that you're not expanding in harm's way when it comes to flooding. So if your town already has zoning, there are a few basic steps that you can take that will provide useful general improvements. The first is to review and update definitions. Are all the terms defined? Are all the definitions clear? You'll also want to review and update the standards. Are they specific, and do they say how the resources should be treating? Do the bylaws implement the town plan? Make sure the important resources identified in the town plan are also addressed in the zoning, and that's usually a big gap. The purpose statement. So the purpose statement are the sections of the zoning that say what different districts are intended to accomplish. Mention natural resources in the purpose statements. Also check to see if a purpose statement mentions protecting natural resources, do the provisions of the zoning actually accomplish that? And also consider adding or strengthening subdivision regulations. For example, strengthen them by talking about minimizing fragmentations or having certain size or smaller building envelopes. So here are a few closing thoughts as you consider whether to use regulations in your town. Regulations happen at the site level, but it also connects to everything else. Understanding the natural resources helps you craft your zoning that helps at the site level and beyond. And remember, even if your town doesn't have regulations, they still have all the non-regulatory tools available that we discussed earlier. In addition, towns without regulations may choose to adopt some, for example, basic subdivision regulations or even standalone ordinances. So congratulations, you've made it to the end of Module B. Here are some resources that we discussed during the presentations. Also see our resource webpage for additional links and information.